It's Sunday, December 6th, 2015, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today we're joined by one of our mentors, Chris Butler, product management consultant, and he's going to lead a talk on business development versus product management. I think a little bit less adversarial than I stated. And just allow me to quickly, briefly explain the format here. So what you see in the room, the people on the bottom of your screen here, are mentors and mentees in the Product Mentor program. Actually in session 4, we've been doing this for a little over 2 years now. And the Product Mentor program is all about pairing up mentors and mentees in the field of product management, all fields, all levels, all around the world, to help make better product managers. And so what we're going to do first is we're just going to quickly go around with some fast introductions. So first I'm going to start with the first person on my left, and I'm going to start with Sharon. So if you could just tell us who you are, whether you're a mentor or mentee, and then just a little bit about yourself. Sharon?
Hi, I'm Sharon. I'm a product manager at AOL. I've been doing product management for about 2 years now, and I joined the program because I really want to learn the skills needed to kind of ascend to the next level when it comes to management. Yeah.
Great. And Sharon does have eyes, even though we couldn't see them just now. And let's go to Nis.
Hey, I'm Nis from Alpha UX. I work on product and content, and I'm a mentor, and just excited to learn about business management or business development.
That's all gets connected now. And Matteo.
Hi everybody. I'm Matteo. I work in San Francisco for Collective Health. I'm a mentee in the program.
Lonnie.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lonnie Rosenbaum. I'm a product manager at a company called Booker. I'm a mentee in the program. I've been doing product a few years, started out as sort of a co-founder for a few years of startups, and now getting more formalized in product management. So super helpful and excited.
Great. And to Chris.
Hi, so I'm Chris Butler. I'm a product manager consultant today, but acting head of product for a company called Blade. My background is a lot of product management and business development, and so I thought this talk might be interesting. I'm actually a mentor for another product manager out of Chicago named Jeff.
Excellent, excellent. And so yeah, so as the mentorship, as the program goes on, post your questions to the productmentor.com/live, and I'll get them fed over to Chris in fairly real time. I'll look for good moments to jump in and get your questions over to him as he talks. And a little bit about myself. I am Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and I'll be moderating today, making sure all the questions and everything goes nice and smoothly for everybody. But with all that said, and time to be as soon as Chris finishes that gulp, over to Chris to begin his talk.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll start sharing my screen now. Basically, Chris Butler, as we were saying, my background includes a lot of product management and business development. And so when I say this product management versus business development, I don't mean it so much in the sense of, product management and business development are arch enemies or anything like that. But just kind of how there are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. And the way I'm going to tell that is really by way of a story where I started in product, went to BD, and then came back to product. So it's kind of a long and tumultuous path through all these different places, but I thought it would be interesting to be able to talk about it. So first of all, what I would love for you to get out of this talk is that business development is a really close relative to product, in the sense that how people think about solving problems within product is very similar to the way people think about solving problems within business development. All of the techniques that are used by BD could actually help the product people be more effective. In that sense, there are a lot of tools, ideas, processes that BD takes on that are very analogous to the different tools and processes that product uses. And then finally, if you're a product person in a small group, sometimes the role of business development will actually be for you, the product person. So this can be a good crash course in a lot of the different things that I've had to go through to be able to understand how BD works and to really excel at that. So, to my story. It really started in college for me with engineering, and for what was probably most interesting for me was really starting to understand near the end of my degree that there's more to building something than just, say, typing out the code for it. I ended up doing a senior project for a site that was really focused on how do you decide what courses to take in which order, how do you get notifications, or understand whether you're ahead or behind of your particular major. And so when thinking about that, I had to really put myself in my own shoes and try to understand, what would I need if I were to use the system out of the box. And so that was maybe the first real brush with product in general. And at the end of my career, I started interviewing, sorry, not career, but college, started interviewing at a bunch of different places, mostly engineering roles, but in particular, one role at Microsoft for their program management position, which I see as very similar to product management. And the key question during the interview was, how would you design a washer-dryer combination for someone that was sight impaired? And to me, this was really interesting. How do you now not only look at it from the standpoint of if you're a user, that's very simple, but how do you start to transfer knowledge from people that you are not to be able to make great decisions about building something? And the real key point to that is empathy. And so, I ended up taking the job at Microsoft, and that was really the first stage of my product related career. From there, I worked on a lot of different things, both as a individual contributor, program manager, as well as a manager of program managers. And I'm not going to go too much into my experience at Microsoft, which was about 7.5 years, just because there's going to be a lot of other product people that will be talking about great things about product itself. So I'm just going to keep moving. And in particular, I just wanted to give people just a quick note that at first product people are not as useful as they are later in their career. And in particular, at Microsoft, we would say that for the first 2 years, you were really training a product person. And this isn't to necessarily discourage you around product, but really just the fact that there's so much to learn and there's so much around experience that really helps you understand how to be a great product person. So after leaving Microsoft, I went to a company called Dash Navigation, and this was really this was a role called the content platform evangelist, which was really a tech evangelist role. And I see tech evangelism as the gateway drug really for business development. And the reason why I say that is that tech evangelists really have to get out into the field, talk with the community that are building things on top of the platform, or even just getting companies to think about a particular space as something that is interesting, right? Like in the case of Dash, this was a product that was a connected GPS device, an actual physical device that would sit on the dash of your car. And we had to go out and make companies and people understand that there was something more to the driving experience than just, say, listening to the radio or having an offline GPS. And so that's where evangelism, I think, really comes in, is this not just partnership and kind of getting people to build things, but getting people to understand why a particular industry or a particular segment should exist. So one of the first things that I learned when I was at Dash was really about building a leads list. And so this is something that I think when we talk about the analogies within product, it's really this idea of understanding how you start to collect a feature list. And in this particular case, we were a connected device in the car. It was something that not a lot of people had thought about before at that point, other than, say, radio. And so we needed to think about, what are the experiences in the car that could be made better if there was actually connectivity. And building that lead list was really focusing on how user scenarios play within the car. And so, what that meant was, for example, radio or support around music was very interesting. Weather, not only because while you're driving, but where you're going to, weather really matters to the passengers. Even other experiences like what do people do, how do they use a car as part of their workflow? So for example, Coldwell Banker or other types of real estate agents, they use their car a lot to go between places and usually have these, wads of paper that they're constantly carrying around. And so in building that leads list, not only do we try to understand what are the most common or most interesting scenarios that we can help people with, but then also what are the groups or companies that actually play within that space, and how do they rank up against each other? So building a rubric really of, how do you find the right partners to work with, and then doing feasibility as far as a partnership. How well could we partner with this person? And so really, I think if anything, the idea of, in a product world, building a feature list, understanding why these features exist, understanding how technically feasible they are, and then whether they make sense and align with the business model is very similar to this tech evangelist or even business development role of, what people do you work with and why would you work with them? The next thing is really understanding your users, partners, and developers. And this is getting to the crux of, how is it that when you're doing partnership within business development, you still need to have a common user scenario or a common segment or common person that you're trying to help with a solution in some way. And the way that I try to think about it is that when you're actually doing product management within a company, you're really focusing on how do you solve a particular problem for someone using the resources that are available within your company. When we talk about how business development aids that process, is that it's not just about your company anymore, but it's about any other end companies that are out there to create a solution that is better than any of the individual companies that could have created alone. So that really starts with this scenario, and that could be for an end user, that could be also for a partner. So if you're making someone's life better within another company because of the partnership. And then, in tech evangelism, it was really about how do we provide these tools to developers to be able to build something that they've never been able to build before. Three, alignment is really difficult. This was something that I learned, when talking to a lot of different companies that I would have thought were interested in working within the car. The kind of ends, the outcome that we were looking for was potentially different. Being a tech evangelist, it was really more about getting people to just think about how do you build things within the car, whereas a lot of other businesses were way more focused on their KPIs, which could be, conversion to a sale, the ability to get a phone call, something like that. And so, I think while doing this tech evangelism at Dash, which also included doing product management of the platform itself, figuring out how do we build these types of environments or platforms so that the partners that we're bringing on that are building something also get whatever it is they want. And so that alignment is really key. So that was the Dash experience for me. But it was really my first foray and, I guess, taste of business development. Where I really became an official business development person was events. And this is the quintessential business development person that I was learning to be. I had to wear slacks and a button-down shirt. Finally, no more shirts and cargo shorts. So events was a very interesting platform. It was basically the ability to collect events, and then they would resell. So events that were happening near you. And then they'd resell access to this platform and then an advertising platform to, first of all, local newspapers, which was a dying industry at the time, even then. And then how did they figure out, longer term, not only mobile, but TV and other types of aspects where aggregation of event information was potentially difficult for these parties that needed to actually have content around events. So I reported to a director and then VP of business development. My title was business development manager. And just something I'd say is if for some reason on the sales and BD side, there's a tendency to add things like manager and other types of titles, which really just means that you're less important than anything else. So anyways, I guess the first major thing that I learned there was really the pitch. And so, this is something that I think we deal with all the time when we talk about product is how is it that you talk to individuals or how do you talk to groups to be able to to convey a message over to them. And so in our case, at events, it was really, we've built this very complex platform that pulls in event information and then makes it available in a way that can be displayed within your own context, so that end users will have more attachment to your particular site or experience or app. And so building out that pitch was really key, and I think BD people tend to focus on this a lot more than product people do, in the sense that there's this idea of troubleshooting your pitch a lot of ways. So like, what are going to be the common things that people are going to object to? Why are they usually going to disagree or not believe a particular thing? And so if you believe that there's going to be some type of objection, into the slide deck you potentially build in those answers before they can actually be asked for. But I think the art of the pitch also says that you don't necessarily leave the hard questions for the person you're pitching to ask, right? So when you're building out a great pitch deck, you actually want to leave small wins for the person you're pitching to, so that they're interactive, first of all, and then second of all, they're not stymied by the fact that you have you've addressed all their questions, but they still feel like they haven't interacted in any way. And so I think there's a lot of art around the pitch that I think I started picking up on it at events, and that nuance is really key, and I think it could be applied better and better to the product world. So the idea of building out really very in-depth understanding about how a particular feature will work. I'm not necessarily advocating something like the waterfall methodology for development, but in the end, I tend to use specs now like I used slide decks within BD. So the idea of building out a doc that has all of my ideas, and I use it as a store point or a save point for thinking, being able to go back day in and day out and understand, like, oh, well, is there something new that I've realized about this particular feature? The same thing happens with business development in a slide deck. As you not only present internally to your peers or to your mentors or management, you're also just constantly learning from yourself, like, oh, well, if I was putting myself in their shoes, this is actually what I would be feeling or thinking or disagreeing with at that moment. So can I add data to the situation? Can I add something where this is a good point for them to ask a question about their particular scenario? So the pitch is really key, and I think it's something that we just don't think about enough on product. We think about the idea that we're all very upfront and honest, and we absolutely should be. That's 100% the case. But maybe crafting the right way to talk about something can make our lives a lot easier. One thing that probably product people don't come across an awful lot, but BD people will really come across almost every single deal, is this idea of legalese within a contract. And this is one of those things that if you did ever want to become a BD person from product, you almost have to do about 10 to 20 deals, and then you've kind of seen every disagreement about a contract that you can see, probably. And so, I've just dropped a couple of the terms here, but really, in the end, what an agreement's about is that it's really the worst case scenario. And so it means that not only for if your partner actually does the worst possible thing, how do you either get out of the agreement or how do you recover from that action, but also if your company or group decides to do something that is the worst case scenario for the partner. And so I think trying to take these types of things personally, I think are maybe the wrong way to go about it. It's more about just the fact that you're going to want to have the most flexibility, your partner's going to want to have the most flexibility, and then you find where the most flexibility actually benefits both of you. Within product groups, though, I actually think that this is an antithesis of what you should be going for, right? Like the idea of having really complex strategies for failure points within a process, I think actually doesn't build a lot of trust within a team, and then starts to allow for essentially bureaucratic pockets where nothing gets done. So I don't know, if I were to say anything, like the reason why these things exist within business development is because there's no, you're two different companies, you're two different entities that are funded in different ways. You're both acting within your both best interest, and so the agreement is really just in the worst case. I would tell you, though, that I've rarely had to dive deep into the worst case scenarios of the agreement, because if you are actually approaching partnerships with trust, which I think every product group should be approaching, working with each other with trust, I think this type of thing is way less necessary. 3, so outreach by any means possible. So as a business development person, you want to talk to a lot of people. A lot of people don't necessarily want to talk to you. And so what that tends to mean is that, yes, you can use LinkedIn. Yes, you should be using people that you know. Yes, you should be using those contact us forms. Really, the excuse of not being able to get in contact with someone, especially in today's world, is a really weak one. And I think, if anything, this is just speaks to the idea around tenacity to get something done. And I think product people really, embody a lot of this. That even though there's potentially humongous odds or there's issues that seem to be roadblocks, this idea of just like persistence is really key. And I think it's something that I've definitely seen, not only from the standpoint of like how do you constantly keep in contact with people, but also just the fact that how do you find the right people to talk to can be a real battle. Maybe one BD hack that I would share with everybody right now is something that I discovered is that because of the way the DMCA is set up, people actually have to list some pretty specific contact information there. So if you do ever need to get in contact with a company and they are not listing a phone number or an email address or anything else, try looking at their DMCA contact information. Just a small hack. So closing techniques. This was something that my manager at events really thought about a lot. I actually feel it's a rather old school way to think about how deals should be done. The concept of closing techniques really comes from this idea that you're trying to sell something once to someone. And I don't think that really works very well when you talk about great BD relationships. It also doesn't work necessarily with what we'd call enterprise sales relationships. And I think it definitely doesn't work when you talk about how product people not only convince, but basically really get people behind a particular strategy. I think this idea of using tricks to fool someone into believing into a strategy is the wrong way to go about it. And so maybe something I learned, I read this book called Spin Selling, which I think was really powerful. And it talks a lot about they had followed a bunch of different salespeople and then looked at the people that were most successful within sales in particular, and then classified or categorized the different types of techniques. And so the people that were very successful in short-term sales, like say you're selling a camera to someone one time at a camera shop, closing techniques are very, very efficient, right? It tends to work very well. But that person, once they get the camera home, they use it, they may realize that it's actually not the right option for them. And so they don't feel good about the experience. And so in the case of business development, great business development is actually about that there's not always a deal to happen right this moment, but there's always the possibility of a future deal. And so this, I think, is very interesting to think about in product in that, yes, there's not always the right solution for a particular problem right now. Or there's a particular customer or person that uses your service that you're not going to be able to make happy right now, but there's the possibility in the future to do that. And so when we think about like how growth happens or how user acquisition happens, we can talk about that. When there's something like an MVP product, you're really only targeting a very particular segment. But making sure that the lines of communication are open with those alternate segments that you may grow into, and the fact that the relationship is in such an honest state that you're not going to miss out, that you're not going to like, try to onboard someone before they're ready or before they actually need your product, means that you can try to get them later when you're actually better equipped to do so. And so I think this is a very interesting book. Probably less, if you're just doing pure product, probably a little bit less interesting. But if you're doing any type of sales or BD, I think this is a really, really amazing book. So negotiation is another thing that comes up a lot with business development and sales in general. And I would just say that, yes, there are, again, a lot of these techniques for how you create leverage within a negotiation point. And a lot of people have a lot of people I've talked to have really, I think the end thing within negotiation is who is really ready to walk away first, is the person who has the power within that negotiation relationship. But when you're talking about how you build good relationships with outside companies or with customers, it's really just, being upfront about what it is you want and need. And I think that's true also about companies, right? So the idea of building a product that has a business strategy that's not aligned with the end customer goal is actually really hazardous, because it creates kind of a false promise with them. And when you're basically trying to pitch someone, or you're trying to onboard someone, you're trying to get someone to use your service, you're really in this negotiation around like, well, here's the things that we can offer you. Here's what you have to give us, and it could be money, it could be information, it could be whatever. And that negotiation really, what's really key there is that everything is out on the table, and that you're not, maybe you're hiding certain things just because it doesn't help necessarily the relationship anyway, but it also shouldn't hurt it. So anyways, I just want to, that's something I think about a lot whenever I think about, the idea of negotiation within that. And maybe like, when we talk about negotiation as well, a little thing that I've just noticed whenever working with like salespeople or other BD people is really this idea that maybe you can use the idea of negotiation tactics that the person is trying to use to your favor. And this is something that I think is very interesting or analogous to the idea around human biases within products. So the idea that we all have human biases that we have a very hard time shutting off, but that those human biases, when we work in a team, we're less likely to actually constantly operate within a biased state because we have other people that have other biases. But then there's this idea that when you're working with someone that's external to your company, or the idea of a customer, using their biases to your benefit and to theirs is actually very powerful. So the idea of how to use, a good example of this that I've just been reading about was where if you're trying to get people to contribute to a 401k, doing opt-out rather opt-in is the powerful way, and the way that you can get people to think about 401ks without having to motivate them to check a box it's way easier. Now, the benefit is still to the end person in that case, because they're getting a 401k when really everybody should have a 401k. Everybody should be planning for their future in some way, for the most part. So using these types of biases, I think, are very interesting. And maybe bringing this full loop back is that when working with external parties, they have their own biases about how they need their company to work. And so understanding what those things are can actually be a very powerful negotiation technique. So a more recent example was whenever working with a vendor, if you're at the end of the month, end of the quarter, or end of the year, there are usually discounts that are to be had because their bias is towards deal flow rather than raw value most of the time. So just something to think about. If you're talking with a vendor and it's near the end of the quarter, push them because you want to pay less money. They want you to pay more money. If you can push on them to pay less, they're way more likely to do that at the end of a actual sales kind of time frame than they are. So maybe this is a good time to just take a brief sidebar to talk a little bit about the differences between sales and BD.
And actually, right before you jump into that sidebar, I'm going to throw over to Lonnie, who's got a question for you.
Great.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, so among product people and business development people in a company, what's a good way for them to work together, to collaborate, to share ideas? I guess ideas can come from anywhere, so how do you get the collaboration process going, and maybe what should each side think about doing?
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
Chris, we can't see your video. If you can jump back to video.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry. 1 second. I will stop screen sharing. There we go. So, yeah, I think the way that BD people and product people really should ideally work together is that they're two sides. Well, let me put it this way, I guess. I see BD people as really the incoming filter for a lot of things within a company. So that means, and I'll talk about this a little bit later during some of my later experiences, but BD people are kind of this filter for the outside world that's slightly different view than other product people. So product people are doing a lot of user interviews. They're constantly looking at behavioral data. They're potentially going out and looking at competitive spaces to be able to better understand how the world works with regards to their user. I think the BD person is really a great tool to use when you need to deal with other companies and not with other people. And so that could mean vendors. So in the build versus buy type of relationship, I think BD people are a really big help in those particular cases. And then I would also say that there are going to be times when you want to build something that requires a suite of tools together to work in harmony. And those are the times that just even chatting with your BD person about like, here's something interesting that we want to do. Are there people within the space that you know about? Because BD people are talking to other companies all the time, whether there's a known high value or not, to a certain extent. It's almost like a like a numbers game to be able to talk to as many people as possible when it comes to BD. So I've used them to also understand like how that works, and I'm going to talk about a couple of these issues as well. Maybe when we talk about just like day-to-day, how do you talk with people? It's this the fact that there's a line of communication that's open is very key, and so that's in kind of two major ways. So one is that BD people should absolutely be aware of where you're at within your pipeline as far as your product features, development, things like that. I'd almost think about them as a very close part of the main team, because if they're aware of things that you're doing, they can be proactive in helping you to make decisions, to give you business case, things like that. And then the other way is true too. Whenever BD people are talking with different external parties, there's always going to be an interesting scenario that will come up that may not be actionable right now, but it's something that the product person should be aware of, just in case there's some way to harmonize that with the rest of the product direction. So yeah, that's maybe like a quick answer so far, but I think it's really just about the fact that like BD people and product people, they're so kindred. I think most of the time it's just they wear different clothing. And business people, BD people, we don't go to like champagne lunches every single day and have that type of thing. So I think there's a misconception that BD people are out partying all the time. We do party occasionally because it's part of the job. But I think this like just thinking of them as very similar to you and concern and considering the same issues as you is really the first part of that whole process.
Great.
Yeah.
I only go to work if there's champagne lunches. So
exactly.
I don't know what you're talking about. So got another question just came in from the wider internet from Ishmeet Singh, and he's asking, how can I as a product manager build business development into my product?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the first step is really just looking outside of your own company, right? So BD is a practice, and it can be a little bit of a fuzzy one, and maybe that's to the detriment of my career. I've always worked in different roles where people ask product people, what is it that you do here? And I think BD people get the similar question in comparison to salespeople. And so the first thing you could really do is just open your scope to say, like, if I were to do something with another company, if I were to do a particular feature, how would I partner with another company to make this feature way more effective? And that's really just the first step. From there, I think, the good thing about BD is that the logistical side of business development, once you do about 10 deals or so, I kind of use as a metric, you kind of understand just how it works, right? Like, it's a bunch of checkboxes. You need to make sure the agreement's correct. You need to make sure that people, you're talking to the right stakeholders, you're talking to the right decision makers, you're avoiding people that are non-decision makers potentially. You're making sure that their team is up to speed, that after you actually do the deal, that's not when things end. So it's stuff like that is really just, after you do a couple of these deals, you'll learn all the mistakes that you need to learn. So I would just say, start talking with external companies, start figuring out how you would work with them. That's the first step.
Excellent. So yeah, keep the questions coming in to theproductmentor.com/live. And with that said, I'm going to hand it back to you, Chris.
Great, thank you. All right. So back to the sidebar around sales versus BD. I think that there is a lot of confusion in companies about the difference between sales and BD, and I really think of it as a continuum. And that continuum, if you think about the idea of not very understood to very understood, I see product as the end where you're not very understood. So you're learning about what types of problems are out there, how could you solve them, and then how would you go about solving them with engineering, things like that. And then on the other extreme, I see sales. So it's very prescriptive in the sense that there's a pitch deck that's probably set, there's a sales sheet, there's onboarding documentation, there's a sales engineer process. There's a bunch of things that within sales, it's very definitive. The parts that's a little bit more complex or unsure is like, who do I talk to within a company to sell something? And then the idea of, is this company the right one? Are they a qualified lead or not? I see business development as in between those two things. There's still a lot of times where whenever a BD person is doing a relationship or a deal, you actually have to build something, and that's where product is again, that kind of kindred spirit. And then there's also this other side that BD people, when you're talking about a very low deal flow that takes a very long time, you may understand an awful lot about how something like that is supposed to go about, but you still, it's very high touch, and that potentially every particular time is unique in the way that you're selling those tools to someone. That's where the BD person comes in. So anyways, it's interesting to think about it that as a product person, as you're building things out that you then want to establish within a market, BD is your first stop. Once BD has really thought about it, done a bunch of experimentation within the market, signed some deals, done some partnerships, that's when you can start to establish it into actually a sales organization that's going out and just like doing raw numbers after that. And then even after that, it's more like DIY. And so some companies will actually skip that whole step for sales and BD, where they just put a DIY type of step. So in the case of, say, advertising, generally advertising starts off as a very high-touch partnership thing, especially when you're talking about non-standardized advertising, so non-IAB, non-ad platform type of stuff. And I'll get to that kind of in the next section. And then, yeah, so I think it's interesting to see that difference, and how you deal with salespeople will be much more about particular answers, and then maybe building up like a FAQ for them to be able to go out and sell. Whereas BD people, it's much closer relationship where you're trying to understand like how do you figure out the right tools to build. So yeah, that's sales versus BD. My next experience was Complete Seating, and that was my own company that I'd started. It was really an open table competitor helping restaurants manage their front of house operations.
Hey Chris, could you go full screen on those slides?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, so Complete Seating, front of house management for restaurants. In this particular case, I didn't do as many BD activities, but I think this is a great example of where, we were a very small company. We were basically 2 full-time people and 2 part-time people, 1 technical co-founder, and then me, kind of the product co-founder that did a little bit of coding, and then 2 restaurant hospitality people. So this is probably a good example of like how a product person could do BD-like operations to help benefit their particular organization. So the first thing that is maybe more of a warning than anything. So there's always this ideal that if you build something that's really great, you can hand it off to another company that does great sales, and then you're just going to make lots of money. And this is generally called a channel sales model. So I guess I'm trying to give you a warning here that channel sales is actually very difficult and requires a lot of care. And in the end, if you can't actually sell something yourself, it's going to be very difficult for you to teach someone else to sell something. And in particular, those groups that take on channel sales relationships, you're still not their top priority, right? Like if anything, you're an add-on or you're a relative product that they want to get a commission on, but there's still something else that they're selling first. So anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there. I think it's really important just to kind of realize that in this mindset, channel is not the panacea of a small startup that doesn't have a sales group. You still need to have a sales group if you're trying to do sales. The next thing is business development is an interesting function in that it's not just about the idea that you're going out and actively doing deals, but the activity itself helps you understand more about where you fit within the ecosystem around you. And so in this particular case, we were a front of house management software as a service, and so we were a competitor to OpenTable, which meant that we were not talking with them necessarily. But there were a lot of other companies. So there were companies like Micros and Aloha that do POS systems. There were different analytics companies that not only did analysis of, say, their like POS data, like what was their sales data like, marketing tools, a bunch of things like that. And so while it was not necessarily valuable for us to create partnerships because we were in the range of tens of restaurants at the time, it wasn't valuable for us to actually create partnerships because we couldn't necessarily, we may be able to offer something slightly better to our customers, but to the other company there was actually way less benefit because it wasn't growing their numbers, unless we were going to do a more in-depth partnership where we were like merging. The idea of doing co-sales was not as interesting. So anyways, like it was very interesting though, because like just being able to understand how, say, the gift card market works within the industry of restaurants was really powerful to understand when we're thinking about how we build great products for, say, loyal customers, or how do you deal with no-shows in a way that right now, people will take a credit card, which is a bad experience all around. It makes the customer pissed off that they had to give money for something they didn't show up for, and it means the restaurant has essentially lost a customer, even though they've recovered some value from the standpoint that there was someone that didn't show up for that reservation. Gift cards, when talking to a gift card company, you could potentially have an interesting idea that maybe there's something that your customer, the restaurant in our case, could do where offering gift cards rather than just charging a credit card. And in those cases, they would still regain some value. They would give something to the customer that would make them feel like we were not just trying to extract value out of them. And then they would get someone that would come back to use that gift card. So that's really an example of where we didn't build an explicit partnership, but just understanding that scenario meant that we could be more prescriptive in the advice to our restaurants and be a better, we could be a better partner to them when we're building something out. After that, when that company started to wind down, I went to work for Waze. And my particular role there was Director of Business Development. And at first I started working as Director of Broadcast Development, which was, if you're familiar with Waze, Waze is a GPS traffic app. It was acquired by Google about 2 years ago now. And the key thing there was that there was really this community of people that while you're using your app, you're actually providing traffic data that then in turn is shared out with the rest of the community. And so it's much more of a personal version of traffic rather than a GPS device where you're on a red segment alone by yourself. And so the goal of my role as Director of Broadcast Development at first was really to focus on how do we get where people are talking about traffic to think about Waze. And in that particular case, it was local TV stations during their morning traffic reports. And so this program ended up becoming a great success. We ended up launching in 20, 30 TV stations that would mention us 3 times a morning, 5 times a week. That ended up being somewhere in the range of tens of millions of dollars worth of free advertising space for simply making some minor adjustments to our product and really building this tool set. So I'll get into that in just a second. This role, kind of like the ones previously, but maybe this was the first time I really, and this is a chimera, which really means an animal that's made up of more than 2 things. And so in this particular case, the role was actually a chimera role of business development and product. And so this was the first one where that was called out specifically for me. And there's both pros and cons of this type of role. I'd say the pro of this role is that you have more of kind of it's part of your role to actually go out and do deals with people, which is good. I think it gets you a lot more exposure. The bad thing is that unless you are the product person in charge of your product stuff, you'll always be thought of as the other, and you're kind of like stuck between 2 worlds where you're creating work. Like if you're talking about a larger organization where there's a huge BD org and there's a huge product org, you're kind of stuck between these 2 orgs where whenever you're trying to work with other people in either of those orgs, you're asking for something, you're basically adding to their task list rather than being aligned with whatever it is, because the deals you're doing are probably way more unique. In the case of Waze, thankfully, these roles were actually, I was the main product person in charge of figuring out what we would build for these people, and then I was also going out and talking with these different TV stations to get them to onboard. So, in this particular case, because the scope was a little bit larger than, it was where we would have conversations with 5 or 10, up to 10 different groups at the same time, some of which would be churning out that weren't valuable to us or we weren't valuable to them, or it would just take a while to close on a particular deal. And so managing and reviewing your queues is something that BD people absolutely do all the time. And product people absolutely do that all the time. In this particular case, I use something called Pipedrive, which if you look at this and you squint your eyes a little bit, it could look like a Trello board with a gray background. So, the idea of being able to write down somewhere and prioritize and then understand where you're at with all these different things is absolutely key with business development, and is something that is just, I think, instinctual within product. So maybe one way of pointing out that they're actually very similar in a lot of ways. Number 2, I think this is an incredibly key point, not only for BD people, but also for product people, and that is don't be the person holding things up. Product and BD tend to both be very I guess, reactive roles to a certain extent. There's an idea that, you still need to be very future thinking. You still need to be planning ahead, but you need to always be hyper reactive to, if we talk about product group, to your team around you. So when an engineer has a question or there's a customer support issue, you want to react to it as fast as possible, because by you not reacting, all you're doing is injecting more time into the process. And the same is true with BD, that other than the times that you're playing hard to get, and that's the only time that this makes sense, but a majority of the time with BD, you're actually just trying to work towards a solution as fast as you can. And so that means that if a partner asks you a question, or they send you a agreement red line, which really just means that their lawyers marked it up, or they have a counter on the terms around the negotiation, you want to get back to them as soon as you can, because you cannot depend on them to always react quickly, right? Like it comes from the standpoint that the only thing you can do around behavior change is really change your own behavior. So don't be that person holding things up. Don't be that person injecting more time. And that's really key both in product and business development. 3, build a toolbox of options. And so, when this goes to maybe that question around how is it that product and BD can do a better job of working together, whenever BD should be going out and understanding the market from a partnership standpoint to be able to distill it down to a few key scenarios that are part of almost every single agreement, essentially, or a part of every single partnership. And so business development should help product understand why a certain set of features in particular would actually help them go out and sign more deals. And so in this particular case, again, I was both the product and the BD person, so it was an easy conversation. But just getting time away from other product priorities is that trade-off, I guess, in this case. And so in particular, there were a lot of things that broadcasters needed that the regular smartphone app just didn't do a great job of. And so things like iPad support was key, right? Because they're not going to be using a mobile phone necessarily on air, and you definitely don't want to just show the viewport of a smartphone on air. So it could be as simple as that. It could be as simple as, well, the color set that we use by default within Waze got really washed out when you go on TV. So how do we provide not only, we provided different color sets that were available by default, but also what is the best color set to be able to provide. But it could also be more kind of more in-depth and bigger features. So on TV, one of the biggest competitors that we had in the space, and maybe just to understand how TV traffic works a little bit, just as a background, maybe more as an interesting concept, is that a lot of people like Clear Channel, Radiate Media, they would actually provide not only the data, but also the actual presentation software and equipment, and then the TV reporter to each of these TV stations. And in return, they would get back essentially ad time on air so that they could resell within their own ad networks. In our case, we didn't care about advertising on these TV stations, other than really just getting our name out. And so we were able to provide these solutions for free as something that would be on top of whatever was available. So our competitors' employees, like the TV reporters that were doing traffic, they'd actually be using our software at the same time. And so one of the things that this software set that they usually would have there would be provide really, really nice animation and sequencing between different points of interest while they were talking about the news. And so that was something that they would only be really willing to do one traffic report per segment with us, because they would have to go and use their finger to find the other place. And so we came up with a very simple sequencing approach that would allow them to add, up to, I think, about 7 or 8 different hotspots that were very interesting, and they would frame them, and they'd essentially take a snapshot. So they could do it very quickly. But then there was still a nice animation between those different points. And so having this tool set not only meant that I could go out and then do great deals with all of these different TV stations, and using, the rubric approach of building of lists to say, like, well, here's the top station in this market, here's the second and third and fourth station, and the truth is that the difference for us between 1 and 2 wasn't that big of a deal, but we tried 1 first and we tried 2 second. I could go out and just talk to almost every major metro within the United States to begin these types of discussions. The great thing about having this toolbox, though, was not only could I use some of those things for TV stations, but now when we wanted to create a program around Department of Transportation, partnerships, so at both a city, county, and state level, and even national levels in certain cases. Being able to provide this tool set, like how do you go and search for things on a laptop or a computer, was something that TV reporters needed to do, but also these DOTs needed to do in their incident centers. So anyways, building a toolbox of options, I think this is like really the key aspect of how product and BD can work really effectively together, is that building a set of options that BD then can go out and use means that their lives become way easier, and it means that product people are doing way less custom work to support business development deals. And so I like this book, Thinking in Systems, or any book really that talks about systems thinking in general, where it's the idea of identifying patterns within different industries and how different industries are actually very similar in how they work. I think it was key to my understanding of this type of thing. Now, you'll be able to also utilize this not only in business development, where how do I use my product and kind of find partnerships within a bunch of different industries, but also from a product perspective, how is it that we utilize our product in a way that makes sense, not only to go after multiple segments, right, that could be in completely separate industries, but also the concept that there are other industries that do something similar to what we need to do, and so how do we utilize their history or their learnings to be able to create great products. So I can't advocate enough the idea of learning more about systems thinking and that type of thing. 4, learn a partner's philosophies, fears, and culture. And so this is very similar to the first point I made when I was at Dash about just like learning what's the common scenario that you're trying to go after, what's the common user, what is that scenario that you're going after. But this is key to maybe more about how communication happens between groups, not only in a BD context between two different companies, but also within the same company between groups or between different types of roles, so product to engineering, things like that. So it's really, there's a type of communication that a particular organization has instilled in it. When I was working at Microsoft, that was email. My most recent roles, it tends to be more in-person or Slack. And so being adaptive to the communication that people feel most comfortable with, I think as a product person and as a BD person, you need to be adaptive. You can definitely curse under your breath that someone's not answering your email, and it's something I had to really break myself of the habit of. But you need to be adaptive to people, and that really the first step of being adaptive is to understand. And so that means not only the communication culture, for example, but like what are the common fears? Like what are people usually worried about whenever they're talking to their managers? How do they look stupid? How do they look smart? Right? How is it that they align with the things that are really the bigger vision within the company, and in particular for their role or for their group? So, anyways, it's just something that next time that you're talking with someone from a product perspective, try to understand from their perspective what is it that they need, or what is it that is kind of default within their way of doing things that you can help adapt to, so that they can be more, so you can both be more successful. Right? This is something I'd say. So the experience after that, there were a couple things in between there, but the next Chimera role that I had, where it was half product, half BD, was Kayak. And this one, I think the thing I touched on a little bit earlier was really guarding your team's time. And I think that's true definitely from a BD perspective for the external world, but then the product perspective from inside your own company. And so something that happened a lot at Kayak was, because Kayak is a big name, there were a lot of different vendors that wanted to sell Kayak something. And so that would mean not only things like, here's a platform that, here's a platform that will help you do this type of reporting or this type of analytics. And a lot of the things that I would hear would be like, free trial, of course. It only takes 10 minutes to integrate. It's only 5 lines of code. I think the times you're going to hear these types of things as a product person is it's going to be, it's only a 20-minute change. It's a very small work item. It's very urgent, so we should take care of it now rather than later. You're the person that's in charge of making sure that only the right things get in through your barrier into the team. And so anyways, it's just something that BD people deal with an awful lot. And I think product people think about it a good amount and tend to be very tenacious usually, but just if you ever forget, you should not forget this point, that you are really kind of the person who's making sure the right things are getting done within the team. And then number 2, really be numbers driven. And so This is something that I think more PM leadership tends to think about, is like, what's that one number that we're all going towards? Is it repeat users? Is it pure conversion? Like, what is that one number? But I think every product person should be hyper aware of not only what is that one number, but what are the counter numbers. So in the case of conversion, when you increase conversion, you could also be potentially increasing things like cancellations or returns. And so how do you make sure that both of those numbers are working in the right direction whenever you're building the future? So be very numbers driven. And maybe one note I would make is that KPI gets thrown around an awful lot. I've seen dashboards where there's like hundreds of quote-unquote KPIs. The KPI is not a KPI if there's over 10 of them. I would even say that the KPI is not a KPI if there's over 5 of them. So just something to keep in mind. And how this relates to business development is that BD tends to have a lot of different numbers when it comes to how successful they are, either on number of deals, customers that the deals actually brought in, amount of money that the deal brought in, all those types of things. So it's something that I feel like for every organization, though, there tends to be maybe a little bit of breakage around losing sight of this one particular metric. So if anything, making sure that product and BD are aligned from the standpoint of that one number, and making sure that you know what that one number is, no matter where you are in the organization, I think is really important. So this was kind of my long and circuitous route back to product, where I now am doing product consulting, and like I said, a head of product for a small aviation software group. And so I guess just to reiterate, really BD is this close relative to product, and I think there are a lot of similarities. And so when you're working with product people, you should take advantage of the fact that they do think creatively and they do try to think about these ideas, even though they may not always talk about it that way. A BD role is actually a very creative role. Things that you can, when you're working with your BD people, there are a lot of techniques that they may be able to help you with, not only with dealing with external customers or companies, but also just in general, like, there are things that they know about that you may not. And so having a closer relationship with them is I think, really helpful. And then finally, when it is all hands on deck, you could take on BD responsibilities and roles, and hopefully this peek into the BD world was helpful. I think, reading up on some sales type of stuff could help you do a better job there as well, but it's really just about going out and applying the same type of thinking, communication, all that type of stuff that you do with product, with BD, could still make you a very successful business development person. And then the last thing is, just be nice to your BD people. I feel like there's a gap sometimes between the two, and so have you hugged your business development person today? Thank you.
Well, some days they get the hugs, right?
Exactly.
Not every day. Awesome. Thanks a lot. Thank you to our speaker, Chris Butler, product management consultant, for today's discussion of business development versus product management. It's a really fascinating career path that you've had. I know myself personally, I've even dabbled on the business development side of the business myself. And as always, the presentation will be posted to our SlideShare channel. And also a big thank you from me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and to everyone else who joined us today, and the product mentor. And don't forget, if you want to be a product mentor, just like Chris Butler here today, we're looking for product people, product mentors of all sorts. Please visit theproductmentor.com and sign up today. Session 5 starts May 1st. We're in 20 countries around the world. We have mentors and mentees everywhere, and we'd love to get some more mentors that want to help out. And also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free-for-all job board, theproductjobs.com. And with that said, thank you, everyone, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.